Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, which is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Wow, that was so beautiful. Bravo. It's both inspiring to hear those glorious words and to see how many of you are able to recite it along with me in an obedient North Korean style. And it's also especially inspiring in these times of such vibrant constitutional debate, of such high stakes for the country, to see you all gathered here to discuss an issue of great constitutional importance, namely, should we hold a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution? Should it be limited to one that is focused on term limits, an amendment that our new president has endorsed, and we have some of the leading proponents in America from both sides of the aisle here together to discuss it? Or should we have an even broader convention to discuss a whole host of other issues that would bring the Constitution closer to the people? That is what we are here to discuss. The subject is crucial, and we have a dream team to discuss it. I have to confess, our dream team is only slightly diminished by the weather. Neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night will stay the Constitution Center from the swift completion of its inspiring mission of constitutional education. Nevertheless, unfortunately, Senator Sass, Mark Meckler, and John Weil have had their flights canceled and will return to us at future times. But like the opera where you announce the understudy, I'm just so delighted to report that the crowd that we have who are about to educate you is so important and substantial and balanced that we're just going to have a spectacular conversation, and I'm going to introduce them in a moment. Who here is a member of the National Constitution Center? Okay, that's beautiful. And the reason that you're here is because this is a special members-only event, and we're going to have this spectacular, incredibly glamorous reception afterward with delicious food and drink, and you know how meaningful it is to be a member and to support our great work. But for those handful of you who are not members, please consider joining this illustrious group as a member of the 1787 Society, as a member of our Chairman's Circle. One great new benefit of membership we've just introduced is Constitution Weekly, where every week, if you don't unsubscribe, we're going to collect all of the great constitutional content, our podcast, the constitutional question of the week, the relevant clause from the interactive Constitution, where you can hear the best arguments on all sides, and all sorts of great educational material to help you educate yourself about the crucial issues in the news. And I'll finally say that as we speak, the Ninth Circuit may be handing down its decision in the case involving the president's immigration ban. We will tell you the news in real time if it occurs, and then you can go to our podcasts and website to get the best arguments on both sides of the case tomorrow to learn more about it. It is now my tremendous pleasure to introduce a great friend of the Constitution Center, a great friend of freedom in America, who conceived of this evening tonight. The reason we are here is because John Aguilar, who's sitting here, cares a lot about liberty and is deeply interested in the merits of a constitutional convention. And he and I met over lunch about a year ago, and we talked about how exciting it would be to bring together the best people in America from both sides of the aisle to talk about a term limits amendment and about a constitutional convention in general. John is chairman of U.S. Term Limits Foundation. He's the head of UM Holdings Limited. He serves on the board of trustees of the Barnes Foundation, the Atlas Society. Among his many incredibly cool achievements is that he owns the movie rights to Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged and has produced the trilogy based on that wonderful novel. And he is a friend of the Constitution and a friend of liberty. Please join me in welcoming John Aguilar.
Well said, Jeff. Good evening, folks. The reality is that other than certainly the 1860s, rarely has America faced such polarization. It's not just political, it's philosophical. And yet there remains common ground on this one issue that both political opposites can still engage. And of course, that issue is congressional term limits. It's a topic for in-depth discussion, and I think tonight is a great time for it. A great time for you to take a position and realize that there's not a lot to hold on to when both extremes are at each other's throats. But this is one issue. In 2015, after having founded the Liberty Congress, I joined forces with a creator of U.S. term limits, Howard. We call him Howie. I can't call him Howie up here, so it's Howard Rich right there. And what he did, good man, what he did was he took this issue, this term limits issue, to the Supreme Court in the early 1990s. I was privileged to have a cigar with Justice Scalia a little over a year ago, and he mentioned the hard fight. It lost 5-4. So through the judicial attack on this issue, we lost. But I think Howie Rich continues with the U.S. term limits, and I think there still remains, it remains valid still for consideration by us. But with the Article 5 consideration, through a states convention of the states amendment by Article 5, this provision is in the Constitution, and it was included in there by none other than James Madison. Thank God for James Madison, because this is an issue where we can have a constitutional amendment for congressional term limits. I hope when we get it done that we take a second step and take a look at what I believe is the real poison of politics, and that is the re-election process. Let's have one 8-year congressman, one 8 or 10-year senator. The first day they're in office, what are they going to do? They're going to work on legacy for their own careers, not lobbying, not re-election, and all the rest of that. Something for another day, so let's work today. Maybe the time for an amendment is now, and so let's discuss it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, John, and thank you again for convening us. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think we should begin with a vote. You know, we are very keen at the Constitution Center on asking you to open your minds to the best arguments on all sides. And after hearing those arguments, to be open to the possibility of changing your constitutional conclusions. But there's a very interesting question on the table, and that is, should we call a convention to amend the Constitution to have a term limits amendment? Or should Congress propose a term limits amendment? So I'll just pose the question simply, should we have a term limits amendment to the US Constitution? I'm gonna ask you that now, and then you'll hear the discussion, and I'm gonna ask you again, and we'll see who changed his or her mind. Who believes that we should have a term limits amendment to the US Constitution? And who believes that we should not? Okay, that's good. My take was that that was sort of 2/3 yes and 1/3 no, which is consistent with national polls suggesting that people on both sides tend to support a term limits amendment by a pretty broad super majority. But now open your minds, cleanse yourself of your preconceptions, set aside your base political views, which are completely unimportant here in the National Constitution Center, and don't ask whether this would be good for your party, but try to listen hard to these really remarkable representatives, statespeople, and scholars and advocates, and decide whether you think that the Republic would be well served by a constitutional amendment. Okay, I'm now going to introduce this incredible panel, and they're going to come out, and here we yes, I'm going to introduce them now, and then like a circus barker, I will bring them out. We're going to begin with a gentleman who's going to be really doing wonderful yeoman service to the Constitution tonight, because he's going to appear on our first panel, and then after a break, he and Governor Rendell will reconvene. Ron DeSantis is U.S. Representative for Florida's 6th Congressional District. He is a graduate of Yale and an honors graduate of Harvard Law School. While at Harvard, he earned a commission in the U.S. Navy as a JAG officer and was a military prosecutor. and as well as being deployed to Iraq as an advisor to U.S. Navy SEAL commanders. He served on the Judiciary Committee, and he has proposed a constitutional term limits amendment. He is a scholar and a representative and is going to really educate us about the amendment that he supports. Suzanne Almeida is executive director of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania. Philip Blumel is the president of U.S. Term Limits, an advocacy group based in D.C. David Super is professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center. David Strauss is professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School. Please join me in welcoming our incredible panelists. Thank you so much. One over would be great. Okay, great. Well, Representative DeSantis, thank you so much for being here. You've come from Florida, and you are going to kick us off. Let me ask, first of all, why have you proposed a term limits amendment, and why do you think the country needs it?
Well, I believe so much in the term limits amendment that I left 80-degree weather to come up with. If you look at how modern Washington operates, we have evolved from a servant class into really a permanent political class. People who get elected tend to stay there. Seniority is really the currency of the kingdom. Harry Truman was a supporter of term limits. He said it cures the two worst legislative diseases, seniority and senility. Now, I'm going to leave the latter issue to someone else, but the seniority is really something that matters. So people have an incentive to stay. So their incentive is to get reelected, and even people with good motives, you don't stay 10, 15, 20 years. You're not going to be in the leadership or be leading a committee. So the incentives are out of whack now with the way Washington is developed. Half of the senators, when they leave the office, 42% of the congressmen, don't actually leave Washington. They go to K Street and they join the influence industry. So people check in and they kind of never leave the beltway. So the idea of a citizen legislator going up, doing the people's business, then coming back and living under the laws that they've passed has really gone the way of the buffalo. And if you look at the results, right now, Washington, D.C., the 4 wealthiest counties in our entire country are suburbs of Washington, D.C. I can tell you, I haven't been there long. They're not developing energy, technology, I mean, it's all because of how government's grown and how people have used the levers of power to benefit private ends. So I think term limits would change the incentives. In the House, the amendment that we proposed, you're there for 3 terms, 6 years, and really get some stuff done. Don't just sit there and wait, and kind of live there forever. Get some stuff done and go home and live under the laws that you pass. So I think it would be a positive reform. I also think it was mentioned the divisions politically that we have, and we do have divisions politically, and that's why it's so remarkable that if you look at term limits, not just today, but 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the support has been overwhelming and endurable. Republican, Democrat, independent, white, black, young, old, it doesn't matter. People support term limits. Those are the types of issues that I think rise to the level of having a constitutional amendment. Term limits support in America is not a transient impulse. This has been a durable desire of the American people for a long time. We have a chance now to move the ball forward because we have a president who says he supports it and has a bully pulpit. So I'm happy to be in the fight, and I really appreciate the Constitution Center for doing this event. It's great.
Wonderful. So your proposal would limit House members to 3 terms and senators to 2 terms, but only a handful of members have joined it. Tell us who they are. Are they from both sides of the aisle? What are the prospects for success in Congress? And since I gather one state has proposed to call a convention on its behalf, what are its prospects for success in calling a convention?
So obviously, this is an example of an issue that the American people are relatively united on. And the Republican Democrats, by and large, in Congress, they don't want to talk about term limits usually. And so we understand that. And it's been very difficult to get a lot of headway since the Supreme Court struck down state-imposed term limits back in the 90s. The difference, though, now, and I don't think it's a partisan issue. We do have some Democrats that are going to support us. We have more Republicans. But with somebody like Trump with his Twitter account, Republicans are in a hot spot on that, because if he starts tweeting about it and telling people we need to do term limits, and at least on the Republican side, if you're not getting in line there, I think you have a lot to fear from some of the voters in the primary. So the issue is going to be elevated, and the way that term limits have been stymied in Washington is not that they get voted down. It's just they never see the light of day. No hearings in committee, no markups, no floor votes. Well, that, I think, will potentially change. It's still obviously a difficult thing to do, because even if we grandfather in existing members, there's going to be natural resistance to doing it. But I think if we move forward and really press the case, who knows what the vote will be, but then you have the folks who are working on the states to try to do it through the states, where you would just go around the Congress and impose term limits. If this ends up being a national topic of discussion, you're going to get a lot of energy all of a sudden into this movement. And so I'm a supporter of passing the amendment through the Congress, but I think doing it through the Article 5 route could be beneficial as well.
This might be a good time to read Article 5. We love to read the Constitution here, and the best place to read it is on the thrilling Interactive Constitution, which you can find on your phones by going to the App Store. But I'm instead, because it'll take me a sec to call it up, I'm going to try to read it without my, see, I don't have my constitutional reading glasses now. The lights would be great. I'm not sure why they're off. They're working on the lights. Thank you for mentioning that. Our panelists will bring lightness to us, but we could use some actual lights. The combination of the poor lights and my poor eyes will make this a drama, but here we go. So here's Article 5, and it says that Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution, or, on application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or conventions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other method of ratification shall be proposed. Okay, complicated, but let's make sure we've got it down. So there are two ways of proposing. Either 2/3 of both houses can propose, or Congress calls a convention on applications of 2/3 of the legislatures of the states. And the congressman just said, unlikely that this amendment's going to be proposed by Congress itself, which wants to protect its seats, but it's possible that 2/3 of the states could apply for convention. But the amendment isn't adopted if it's proposed. In order to be ratified, it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the legislatures of the states, or by 3/4 of special conventions that are called by the state. So it's really hard to pass an amendment, and we're going to be discussing that process today. Congressman, just one or two more questions before I bring in our other panelists. You're a scholar, a legal scholar, and know the history of all this. Have we had term limits before in American history? How did they fare? And why did the Supreme Court, by that 5-4 decision, strike them down? What was the reasoning of that decision?
So you actually had term limits during the Articles of Confederation. We had the debate about the Constitution. Founders debated very seriously. They called it rotation in office then. And you had some people, Jefferson was not involved with the Constitutional Convention. He really believed in term limits. Madison said, you know, you're going to end up potentially diluting the expertise, and he erred on the side of not doing it. So they decided not to do it. And I think it was actually the right decision at the time. It was a much different political culture. The reason why people ran for office was different. I mean, once they moved the capital to the Potomac, I don't think you could find an example of a congressman serving 20 years and then lobbying for 20 years afterwards. That's just not the way it worked then. So I think they made the right decision to do that. And I think it, by and large, worked well. And even a lot of the people who have been very serious senators that we know, like Daniel Webster, a lot of them did not serve continuously for 30 or 40 years. They'd go, they'd serve, they'd come back. Sometimes they get called back into service. So the modern term limits movement, I think, really has grown over the last 25, 30 years, where you've seen the rise of careerism in Congress. You've seen the re-election rates, 95, 96, 97%. I think part of the reason for that is the campaign finance reform reforms in the 70s, which really benefit incumbent office holders big time, makes it very difficult to challenge an incumbent, particularly in a primary, which is to beat an incumbent in 80% of the districts in our country, it's going to go to one party or the other in the general, so you got to beat them in a primary. Very difficult to do. So you have people like Howie Rich who are going to the states and saying, term limit your congressmen and U.S. senators. Put it in your state constitution. Florida did it. Arkansas did it. Others. That was challenged in the court. It went up to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a decision in 1995 called U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton. And we lost 5-4. Justice Thomas wrote the dissent, which I think was more persuasive. But basically, the court ruled that states cannot impose any additional requirements over what's in the Constitution. So you got to be 30 years old to be a senator, 25 to be a U.S. congressman. You have to have residency for a certain long time president. You got to be natural born. There's different qualifications enumerated. So once that happened, it became much more difficult to move term limits, because if you can't do it through the states with a state amendment or even state legislation, you got to do a federal constitutional amendment. And so that's kind of brought us to where we are today. Term limits, very difficult to see the light of day. Now we have a president who supports it, although the president doesn't have a formal role, of course, in constitutional amendment process, but to be able to shine a light on it has given, I think right now, term limits, we have the best chance to move the ball forward than we've had since the Thornton case was handed down in '95.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for introducing us so well. The Congressman is going to remain part of this discussion, and we'll end with Governor Rendell to talk about their bipartisan support. But I want to bring in our two scholars here. David Super, I have to say, gave one of the best arguments opposing a constitutional convention in a recent debate we had with Intelligence Squared in New York, so much so that he swayed the audience single-handedly. They shifted from supporting a constitutional convention to opposing it, and it was a dazzling performance, and we're very glad that he's back. Unfortunately, David Strauss is equally dazzling and gave an amazing conversation with Michael McConnell in Charleston for the Philanthropy Roundtable for the Constitution Center about constitutional interpretation. Also is not crazy about a convention, but wearing his very moderate and thoughtful descriptor hat, I'm going to ask him to kick us off. David, tell us about the Thornton decision. What did Justice Stevens say? What was the basis for Justice Thomas's dissent? And who do you find more persuasive?
Well, is this on term limits or on the convention?
On the term limits.
On the term limits. Let me just say a word about, this is a cautionary note. On term limits, I'm agnostic. On conventions, as Jeff said, I'm not. I think they're a bad idea, although I'm happy to try to explain the case for. My cautionary note about term limits is this. In any organization, there is always a struggle when someone new comes in at the top, because there are people in the organization who've been there for years, and they know the stuff, and they have the relationships, and they know where the bodies are buried. And when someone new comes in at the top, a new CEO for a corporation, a new president of the United States, a new head of a government agency, a new president of a university, for example, they have to count on the people who've been there for a long time to show them the ropes and carry out their will. And they are at a disadvantage because they don't know the subject as well, and they don't know what's gone on in the past, and they don't have the relationships. The risk I see with term limits, and I don't mean to be against them, but I do think it's something to be concerned about, is that you'll end up empowering permanent Washington. That is to say, congressional staffers, people in the bureaus, and interest groups, because they don't have term limits, and they will stick around. And a new member of Congress will come in, say, with an interest in armed services or the environment or government lands or finance, and will be dealing with people who know a lot more and are able to maneuver in the environment. And if that person is only going to be there for 2 or 4 or 6 years, then the permanent Washington has every incentive to stick around, drag their feet a little bit, slow walk some things, wait for that person's term to expire, get near the end of his term, and continue to do what they've always been doing. Now, maybe that's okay. Maybe it'll lead to more technocratic, incompetent, and less political government. Maybe it's not okay because it'll lead to domination by interest groups and these entrenched people. But I do see that as a risk of term limits.
Great. Well, we're going to dig into the term limits substantive debate a little bit later, but I want to just put the constitutional arguments on the table. David Super, is there another word to say about what Justice Stevens said and what Justice Thomas said on constitutional grounds in the Thornton case? Can you just describe the reasoning of the decision to the audience?
The basic question here is whether the Constitution sets out exclusively the criteria for who can come into these federal offices or not. There's no question that states have wide control over who can serve in state offices. The question is whether the list in the Constitution is exclusive or invites states to do more.
And Justice Thomas said they were not. Did he appeal to history? And were there examples of the framers appear to have been divided about this? Jefferson liked them, and some other framers were agnostic. What was Thomas's historical case in favor of the constitutionality of term limits?
Again, as was mentioned, Thomas Jefferson was very important in the early days of the Republic, but not in that particular episode, at least not directly. There was certainly division among the framers on that, and as there were on a great many issues. Yeah.
Okay, well thank you for that, and let's now dig into this broader question of should we call a convention of the states? Ladies and gentlemen, what's so dramatic about this question is never before in American history has the Constitution been amended by an amendment proposed by a convention of the states. And yet, 27 states have called on Congress to call a convention for the purpose of proposing a balanced budget amendment. Only 34 states are necessary to require Congress to call a convention. So this is not a hypothetical possibility. It is possible that if 34 states call on Congress to call a convention to propose a balanced budget amendment, that convention will be called. And then the question is, will that convention be limited to proposing a balanced budget amendment, or could we have a runaway convention that could propose not only a budget amendment, but maybe a term limits amendment, or an amendment to repeal the First Amendment, or do all sorts of other crazy things like that? So David, let's give us the arguments, let's ventilate and discuss the arguments for and against calling a convention of the states. I want to save David's whiz-bang closing for just a bit because it's so, I've heard it and it's really good. David, give us, the kind of thoughtful arguments for and against the wisdom of calling a
We have a multiple David
convention.
situation.
Yes, exactly.
Me,
yeah. David Strauss.
Well, this is, as I said, I'm not in favor of the convention, but let me try to describe what I think is that provision is doing in the Constitution. As Jeff said when he was reading from Article 5, there are basically two ways the Constitution can get amended. Congress can propose an amendment, or a convention of the states can propose an amendment. In either case, the proposal goes before the states, in the case of the convention, before the states again, in a sense, and 3/4 of the states have to approve it. So we're really talking about how it's proposed. Every amendment to the Constitution that's been adopted so far has been proposed by Congress, by a 2/3 vote of each house in Congress. As Jeff said, this would be a first-time event if we were to have a convention. Convention can be called, or it's called by Congress, but Congress has to call it if 2/3 of the states want it. And then Congress would be cut out of the picture. The decision about what amendments to propose would be entirely in the hands of this convention composed of delegates from various states. And Congress would never get its hands on the proposed amendments. Now, I think if you think about what the country looked like at the founding, you can understand why that approach might have been appealing to many of the framers. At that time, the states were much stronger and more important entities, both practically and sort of emotionally, than they are today. And you might even think by analogy to the European Union, where the idea that a federal body sitting somewhere remote from the capitals of the European countries, sitting in Brussels or in Strasbourg, that body would propose changes to the Constitution, and it alone could decide what changes would be proposed. You can see why that would not be acceptable to European nations. And to the extent our country at the founding was like that, where they would think, well, we want to maintain some control in our state capitals over what amendments to the Constitution are proposed. It's fine if Congress is sitting in the nation's capital wants to propose it. We want to be able to cut Congress out of the picture if we think it's important to amend the Constitution. How do we do that? Well, let's have this provision that if 2/3 of us think it's important, we will get together, our delegates will decide what amendments should be proposed. And I think that vision of the nation is what underlies this provision.
Thanks for that great setup. So David Super, just on the question of the Convention of the States, you've argued that that would give undue weight to the votes of the individual states and might allow an amendment to be passed without supermajority support from the people of the United States as a whole. Talk about the case for and against a Convention of the States in particular.
Well, one of the great triumphs of the 20th century in promoting our democracy was one person, one vote. That's something that I think is widely regarded now as having fixed a problem that lingered too long, where we did not give people equal votes and equal influence. Article 5 is silent as to whether in a convention you would have representation proportionate to the populations of states, or whether Pennsylvania would have the same representation that Wyoming did, despite obviously a vastly greater population. That's a pretty significant issue. And if we have a process where every state counts the same in the convention and every state counts the same in the ratification process, which we know they do, then you could have an amendment that is supported, proposed, and passed by states representing a minority, not a supermajority, but actually a minority of the population, could amend our Constitution. That strikes me as very dangerous. The founders put in the provision after much discussion for state-initiated constitutional conventions as an emergency safeguard. And in the beginning of the Republic, when Congress convened, there was a discussion, well, we said we want to do something about a Bill of Rights. Let's get a convention together and do that. No one was more terrified by that proposal than James Madison, because he'd seen how a convention charged with writing a constitution can get a mind of its own and jump the tracks.
Well, we will talk about that danger of a runaway convention jumping the tracks in a moment, but you put on the table, both of our scholars have, this possibility of an amendment passed without deep majority support from the people of the United States. Philip Blumel, I was taught in law school that the point of a constitutional amendment is to represent the deep, considered, deliberative, fundamental values of the American people as a whole. Are you concerned that a term limits amendment that emerged from a Convention of the States might not have deep supermajority support?
Well, on the specific issue of term limits, we already know that the issue itself has supermajority support from across the political spectrum. When the states will send delegates to a convention to propose an amendment, which is basically what Congress does when it's considering an amendment, it's simply a proposal. They're going to send delegates from each of the representative states in order to do that deliberation. The states don't write an amendment and send it to the convention for approval. The way the founders created this system is that the convention itself would be the deliberative body to come up with the details on this, and all the states would weigh in. Now, as far as the issue of whether the representation is, I think it's an important consideration, but it's not the major one. One of the key reasons why the whole idea of the convention process was put into the Constitution is because there's times when the people in the states need to take actions that Congress will not. It is for the purpose of going around the Congress. And there's certain issues that is particularly true on, and term limits is one. If you remember with the direct election of senators back in the early part of the 20th century, both parties were clamoring for the idea of having elections done directly like they were in the House successfully in the U.S. Senate, because you recall prior to 1913, the states sent senators to Washington. And so this issue passed the House several times, direct election of senators, an amendment, but couldn't get out of a committee in the Senate. Well, it's obvious why, right? That was a natural case for a convention to go around Congress. And indeed, at that time, 30 states did apply for a amendment proposing convention for the purpose of mandating or permitting direct election of senators. Now, the convention was never held because once 30 states made the application, Congress saw the writing on the wall, and even the Senate saw the writing on the wall, and they passed it themselves. And that was the success of the Article 5 convention, even though the convention was never held. But it also illustrates the fact that the issue of there's issues that are important for the people in the states to handle that Congress won't. And so when the founders said, and particularly on more anti-federalist side, that when they put two routes to amend the Constitution, and that was one of the reasons, and they said so explicitly.
Fascinating point. I want to ask Suzanne to respond to it in a second, but first I have to give you some breaking constitutional news. Here at the Constitution Center, you get your constitutional news within at least 12 minutes after it comes down. And thank you for not checking your Twitter feeds before then. Ladies and gentlemen, a 3-judge federal appeals panel has unanimously refused to reinstate President Trump's travel ban. I know that those applause are on a nonpartisan basis for a job well done by these 3 judges, and they held that the government does not show likely success or irreparable harm. We will have lots of analysis of this fascinating decision after we've had a chance to read it. Suzanne, Philip made a really interesting point. Yes, I discuss among yourself for a moment. I know you want to now, like a laser, return your focus to this similarly important constitutional question, which really is, and Philip phrased it very well. His response to David was, sure, in theory, you could have an amendment that was proposed by single states that represented less than a majority of the people, but it wouldn't be ratified unless there were supermajority support. And then he said, Suzanne, in some cases, like term limits, you have a question which is popular with supermajorities, but which Congress won't propose because they're trying to protect their own seats. And in this case, the Convention of the States mode does serve supermajority interests. What's your response to that?
I mean, I think that there is certainly a role for the Convention of the States to go around Congress in places where Congress can't or won't act. And I think that there are differences in the can't and the won't. And I think in the term limits and in the direct election of senators, we're possibly dealing with a won't rather than a can't. I do think that there are safeguards that need to be put in place before or during the rule-making process of a constitutional convention in order to make sure that it is, in fact, serving the interests of the people. There need to be rules as far as transparency. There need to be rules as far as delegates being elected, not appointed by the state. So there are a number of places that I guess the devil is in the details as far as deciding whether or not to support or oppose a constitutional convention. It really comes down, at least from my perspective, to really what the details are and how that convention will be held.
Great. Well, let's dig into those details in a moment. Before we do, Congressman, any thoughts on the merits of a convention of the states, which, as we've been discussing, is a method that's never been used before? Does it fairly represent the deep views of the people, and is it a good method? Why did the framers include it?
So I think it's what Phil says exactly right, and we see this now. I mean, we have really a permanent political class, in many ways existing separate and distinct from the rest of the American people. Just as an aside, with the argument that if you have term limits, the bureaucracy would be powerful and the interest groups would be powerful. Has anyone been to Washington lately? That's how we have it now. So I don't think it could get much worse. But that being said, so clearly it was a safety valve to go around people who were not willing to listen to the American people. And yes, when you're talking about 38 states needing to ratify an amendment, I'm just not worried. Mathematically, theoretically, it is possible. You could have states representing 48% of the people vote to, I think you maybe Florida, Texas, California, New York, Pennsylvania, we're all on the opposite side, maybe, but that's just not likely to happen. And so I think that it is useful to be able to do, but it has never been done before. The reason why I think term limits would be a great opportunity for it is because it's not really an ideological thing. Like, I support a balanced budget amendment. a lot of my Republican colleagues do. You start going into blue states, maybe not as much. It's a little bit more of a little bit more partisan. You start getting into some other proposals of trying to restrict the federal government's authority. That really isn't going to sell in blue states. So you need to find something that could bring unity, and I think term limits is one. So if this provision of the Constitution ever going to be used, I think term limits to me is the safest one to use it for.
Great. The safest one to use it for is a good way to introduce the second topic, which is so important. Is it safe, or is there a risk of a runaway convention? David, we're taught in law school that the Constitution itself was ratified according to procedures that were illegal according to those specified in the Articles of Confederation, which said that any amendments had to be unanimously approved. And the framers, invoking the natural right to alter and abolish government, which Jefferson said came from God or nature rather than government itself, assumed that they could come up with new procedures in the convention itself. So is there a risk of a runaway convention, and what might those risks be?
Yes, I think there is. Jeff, I think in your introduction to the subject, you really hit the nail on the head when you said this has never been tried before, and we just have no idea how it would work. So let me give you some examples. 2/3 of the states in total call for a convention, but some of them want a convention and say they want a convention to consider a balanced budget amendment. Some of them say we don't want any part of a balanced budget. We want a convention to overrule Citizens United. But 2/3 of the states call for a convention. So there's a convention. Now the convention comes forward with something, a balanced budget amendment, something about campaign finance. Now what happens? Can someone complain and say, wait a second, you weren't authorized to do that. We just authorized you to do the other thing. Can they do that? And who settles that dispute? Ordinarily, disputes like that get settled by the courts. There'd be a proposed amendment, and if we're adopted by 3/4 of the states, you would think, well, the courts will decide as part of the Constitution. The courts will not do that. Yeah. It would be a real breach with established ways of doing things for one simple reason, which is the amendment process is the one sure way to overturn a decision of the courts, of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is not going to get its hands into whether an amendment is valid. So you could easily have a situation, well, not easily, if you have a convention, you can foresee, without too much difficulty, a situation in which it's just a mess. An amendment's been proposed, maybe it's been ratified, and no one knows whether it's valid or not. And we don't have a method for deciding that. Now, Congressman DeSantis said, and he certainly has a point, look, 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. That's a pretty good safeguard, and it is a pretty good safeguard. But here's a problem with that. It's a problem that actually has been illustrated relatively recently in our history by the 27th Amendment. The 27th Amendment was proposed in 1791. It was ratified, it became part of the Constitution in what, 2002, something like that?
92.
Yes. 1992. 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. It was not a particularly significant amendment. 3/4 of states had to ratify it, just stuck around out there and picked up the occasional ratification over a period of time. And after a while, it got 3/4 of the states. Now, that amendment didn't rouse much controversy, so people could live with it. But if the convention proposed an amendment, it just hangs out there for a few decades and eventually accumulates 3/4 of the states. It doesn't look like there's much of a national consensus behind it, and there's no real mechanism for deciding that. I think a constitutional convention is a huge leap into the unknown. And I actually think, if you're a small c conservative, and you think, if we've been doing something a certain way for a long time, and maybe it's a pretty good way to do it, and I'm not sure a bunch of people could come along and get together in a convention and make things better. If you're that kind of conservative, then you should find the prospect of a constitutional convention abhorrent.
Thank you for that powerful statement. David, I love the fact that every time you speak, a new halo of golden light suffuses you.
Yes,
sort of fills the theater.
That's been true for many years.
It's just beautiful. I want to stick next to this guy. But despite that, Phil, you were shaking your head, and in particular, you were not convinced that there could be these kind of lingering amendments that would be waiting like a loaded gun to be ratified by some future convention.
No, I think that's highly unlikely, but I want to make a larger point, just to remind everyone that a convention would not have any power to either create, alter, or abolish any law. It is a convention for proposing amendments, much like the power that the Congress has right now to propose an amendment anytime. It's a permanent runaway convention in that respect. any subject that the Congress wants to propose an amendment for, they can do so. But the protection that we have against that is that ratification process. Congress or a runaway convention can come up with any number of ideas, but they have to go through 3/4 of the states in order for it to be ratified, and that's a tremendous hurdle. The Equal Rights Amendment couldn't pass. We had 10 years to pass that, and it could not. And so we have an enormous amount of protection. I would say one other thing that's very important, too, about the runaway issue is that I guess it would also depend on whether the convention was going to be on completely wide open on multiple subjects, or whether states, in their power to call a convention, called it for a specific subject. Because, for instance, to use the term limits example, the state of Florida passed an application to call for a Amendment 5 amendment writing convention solely limited to the subject of congressional term limits and no other. Now, if 34 states call for a convention limited to the subject of congressional term limits and no other, certainly there'll be a convention that is limited to that subject. States will send delegates with those instructions. And let's say then, all right, absolutely any one of those delegates could come up with a rogue delegate could certainly raise his hand and make a motion to bring up some other subject. And there's no reason, you're right, that we can say that would not occur. However, keep in mind, if it was called for a certain convention and delegates were sent to there for that reason, I would find that very unlikely. The conspiracy would have to be pretty darn deep. But remember, even if there were one, as outrageous as that might sound, 38 states. That's going to be red and blue states. And it's not just 30. It's actually harder than that because it's actually 75 houses. Because it would have to pass both chambers. Nebraska has one. They'd have to pass both chambers of each state. Any one of the hurdle is so high, I don't see it. I think it's a tremendous protection, and our founders are right to make it difficult. It might even be impossible. It hasn't been done yet, right? So it's a very hard thing to do, and I'm not worried about that running away.
Okay, a vigorous head shake from David, but the congressman wants to jump in, maybe on this question of a runaway convention.
Well, I just think if you look back at the founding era, the Jeffersonian position about constitutions was like, every 20 years, get rid of it. Why should the next generation live under someone else's constitution? He wanted it constantly to be redone. Madison said, when you have the fundamental law of the country, it's too ticklish of a nature to constantly be reopening this. And so he wanted there to be a valve for amendments, but he wanted that to be very difficult. And I think if you look at American history, we have erred way on the side of the Madisonian. Not only, structurally, obviously, it's in the Constitution, but it's even more difficult to actually amend the Constitution than they probably would have envisioned that they were doing in terms of the practice. So I understand things could potentially happen, but just imagine any state that you're from, would your state legislature vote to get rid of the Bill of Rights or to do something like that? They'd get voted out of office very quickly. So I'm not as worried about it just because American history shows that it's very difficult. And we haven't had a constitutional amendment in this country in about 50 years. The 92, but the ones in terms of proposed relatively recently, it's been a long time. And so it's very, very difficult to get that 3/4 to ratify anything.
Okay, David, take it away.
Well, we keep talking as if there is a provision in Article 5 that allows states to limit what a convention is for. And I've read Article 5 quite a few times, and I can't find that anywhere. It's not there. It's something that is talked about by proponents of the convention, but there's no control. There's no provision for it. Indeed, one could argue that just as states may not be able to limit further limit what qualifications there are for members of Congress, that they may not be able to limit what their delegates do at the convention. It's impossible for me to think about what exactly you would do if your delegates did something that you didn't want. And frankly, in our very willful, hardly Solomonic political era, if moneyed interests approach the delegates and say, hey, how about we do this or how about we do that, there's going to be a very strong urge to do it. And the delegates are not likely to be ordinary people like you and me. They're likely, frankly, to be state legislators seeking to advance their political careers, and will be very conscious of what the donors do. In addition, this notion that 38 states have to ratify it, we keep assuming it's a unitary it. 7 of the amendments in the current Constitution, including some of the most important, 5th, 14th, and so on, have multiple purposes. So what would happen if an amendment goes out there with term limits and rewriting the Second Amendment? Would that get ratified? I know a lot of folks, a lot of liberals would like to rewrite the Second Amendment, aren't so keen on term limits, might be willing to go for it in balance. Conservatives the flip, or term limits and a balanced budget amendment. How would that get ratified or not? There's a lot of log rolling that's common in Congress today, and there's no reason to think that a convention wouldn't do the same.
Suzanne, are you concerned about a runaway convention or not? What about David's point that it's likely to be self-interested state legislators, and what do you think might emerge from a convention?
I mean, I think it's definitely more likely to be unordinary people, not Joe Schmo off the street who's run. Although I think that because states have the ability to create these rules as to who their delegates are, there could possibly be protections put in place by the states. Do I think that's necessarily likely? No. But wearing my League of Women Voters Good Government hat, I would like to think it was. And so I think that if there can be additional restrictions put on or additional qualifications, then I think that would make a lot of sense for states to do. I think that there's a really good point about, so if an amendment goes out with multiple parts, can it be ratified in part but not in whole? There are multiple ratification processes described in Article 5. Is there a weighing system as to which matter more? So there are just a lot of unknowns as far as what a convention of the states would look like. And while I am not necessarily opposed absolutely to a convention of the states, I think that there are a lot of questions that would have to be addressed in order to have a productive convention.
Philip, what are the other most popular amendments out there? A balanced budget seems to be the most popular, judged by 27 states.
Right.
Then there's term limits, one state. The Citizens United amendment is up there. What else is popular, and what might possibly be on the table?
Those are the 3 main single-issue campaigns for Article 5 convention. There's an effort also out there that's broader. It's called the Convention of States. And they are looking at a larger and largely unspecified list of potential amendments. But the one that's really got the most traction is the balanced budget. They have the most applications, and I think that they have probably the best. Balanced budget is another one of these issues, like term limits, although not as much as term limits, that does have some appeal across the board. But honestly, and this is why we're working on the Article 5 Amendment Convention for term limits, is that's the issue that I think has the most broadest appeal across the board, and is the most logical for a reform for a constitution. It's a constitutional rule, just like the 22nd Amendment with term limits for the president, which has worked out fine and without much controversy or problem. And so I think that's the term limits, I think, has the best chance of succeeding in convention, but it's likely that balanced budget would get there first.
Congressman Philip mentioned Mark Meckler's project of the Convention of the States, which identifies 4 big problems. Abuses perpetrated by the federal government. First, the spending and debt crisis. Second, the regulatory crisis. Third, congressional attacks on state sovereignty. And fourth, federal takeover of the decision-making process. And the Convention of the States movement hopes to have a broad-ranging conversation about protecting state sovereignty and limiting federal power. Might that succeed? What traction is that in the country as a whole? And how much juice do these guys have?
Well, I think that, as has been discussed, that this is, we're in uncharted territory if you go a amendment convention route. The more of those things you enumerate, although I personally am supportive of those 4 things and trying to remedy some of the problems, you start to get into more divisive issues. And so again, if we're talking about broad agreement in society, you do the one shot at a term limits amendment or a balanced budget amendment, you're going to start getting, and I'm a big proponent of the balanced budget amendment, but when the rubber hits the road on that, it's going to be harder to get 38 states for that than for a term limits amendment. And the reason is very simple. As a congressman, who comes to see you? State legislators, county commissioners, governors. What do they want? Federal money. Why? Because we have a credit card. Just charge it, give you more money. You do a balanced budget amendment, all of a sudden the states and the localities, they're going to say, you know what, we may have to pay for more of our stuff. We may have to raise taxes. So politically, if it gets a little closer, you could see more of a blowback. And if you're in some of the states that have significant pension crises, that may want to seek a federal bailout, I mean, it just, the term limits, there's much less of a downside from a state's perspective. And in fact, think about it. Doing term limits through the Congress, which we're trying to do, cuts against the self-interest of the average member of Congress. Doing it around Congress and having the states ratify, that is coinciding with the interest of state reps and state senators, because why? Term limit congressmen, then they can run for Congress sooner, so they have more places to run. So that's just kind of how you have to think about, just realistically, how these things go, although I am supportive of doing the balanced budget amendment.
David Strauss, historically, calls to have a convention of the states have concentrated Congress's mind. And in the case of the 17th Amendment, which provides for the direct election of senators, which used to be elected by state legislatures, and which Justice Scalia, during one of his last appearances in Philadelphia, I think it was when you saw him, John, he said at the Union League, he thought the greatest threat to federalism of American history was the 17th Amendment. He said federalism is dead and individual liberty is dead because of that 17th Amendment, so he was not a fan of it. But it was passed after a bunch of states called for a convention to provide for the direct election of senators, and then Congress, in order to control the procedure, swept in and drafted the amendment that it wouldn't have drafted otherwise. David, might a similar thing happen with a term limits amendment, and are these calls for a convention useful in forcing Congress's hand?
Well, I think the calls for a convention could be useful in trying to get Congress's attention. I think that's a fair point, Jeff. But here's a story about the 17th Amendment. It's actually a more complicated story than you might think. As Philip said, when the Constitution was adopted, the Senate was chosen by the legislatures of the states, not by a popular vote of the states. But starting pretty early on, by the middle of the 19th century, people began to chafe against that and think they should have a vote for their senators. You remember the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates? When Lincoln and Douglas were debating, they're running for the Senate. They had debates throughout the state of Illinois. Now, why were they doing that when it was the legislature that was going to elect the senator? Why didn't they just go to Springfield and have their debate in front of the Senate? Well, I'll tell you why. Because a big issue in the state legislative elections was, who are you going to vote for senator? That way of thinking caught on. And by the time the 17th Amendment was adopted, many states had already, in effect, gotten to the point where they were electing their senators by popular vote. Here's how they did it. In a lot of states, they had a quote-unquote primary for the senator. They couldn't elect the senator directly, but the Senate candidates, like Lincoln and Douglas, that didn't happen then, but Senate candidates like that would run in a non-binding primary. And then if you were a person running for the state legislature, you were asked, are you going to support the winner of the primary, whoever it is? And of course, there was a lot of pressure to say, of course, I'll abide by the will of the people. Some states got to the point where if you didn't promise to support the winner of the primary, whoever it was, you got a black mark next to your name on the ballot saying something like, hates the people, or something like that. It wasn't that bad, but you get the idea. And that, talk about getting their attention, that got to their attention. There was, in fact, an exchange on the floor of the Senate where the 17th Amendment was being considered, where one senator said, you know, we're just doing something that people have already done. And an opponent of the 17th Amendment says, yes, they've done it. Like a bunch of burglars, they've done it. And the first senator said, well, yes, but they've done it. So the moral of the story is when the people want something, they have ways of getting it. And in the case of the 17th Amendment, we were practically there before the 17th Amendment was adopted. And I could foresee a scenario like that with term limits, where if people really want term limits and really put it to their members of Congress, you know, I want you to support term limits and I'm watching. And if you don't support term limits, you're going to pay for it in the next election. We would get term limits. If we don't get it that way, then you have to wonder whether this is one of those issues on which people in a poll, when they're asked, do you support term limits? I say, yeah, I'm for term limits. It doesn't matter to them that much. And if that's the situation, maybe we shouldn't have them.
We're going to delve into the merits of the term limits amendment again in a sec, but just on the broader Article 5 question, David, I've heard you do it. Do you feel like we ventilated all of the dangers of an Article 5 convention, or do you want to add a few more?
Sadly, there's quite a few of them. I think one question is, when are we in the right frame of mind to open up the Constitution? There may have been a time when we came together with a positive, proud, problem-solving state of mind, perhaps after the victory in World War II, when that might have been something to discuss. The U.S. its economy had changed, its government had changed, its role in the world had changed. Maybe that would have been a time to discuss it. But now, is there any politician out there, and I don't mean any disrespect to anyone in particular, but is there anyone that is one could expect would dominate a convention with a steadying hand the way George Washington did, or that would take the long view the way James Madison did? That's not the times we live in. Right now, 4 of the last 5 presidential elections were regarded as illegitimate by large segments of the population. The hanging Chad issue, the birther issue twice, and then the issues of the FBI and Russian influence is the most recent time. So we have presidents who are widely disrespected by a large part of our people. What holds us together more than anything else, what identifies this country more than anything else, is the Constitution. If we have a constitutional convention, the moneyed interests will descend on it. They will descend upon the state legislatures that are deciding ratification. We'll have log rolling, we'll have deals, we'll have secret deals, and we may end up with a constitution that is widely regarded as illegitimate as well. If that happens, we are truly lost.
That is a powerful statement, and I think it needs a... I told you that it was really strong and it swayed the audience last time, so Congressman Phil, response. Congressman.
Well, look, I think that there are divisions in the country, obviously. I mean, I think something like term limits is one thing that would bring people together, because I think there's a broad dissatisfaction with the governing class in Washington, and I think there has been this for years and years and years, and it doesn't even matter which party is in control of the Congress. The ratings are dismal, and I think it could be a way to actually bring people together. And I don't think you're in a situation where you're going to have a Washington, presiding over the whole change of the Constitution. That's not what I would want. I don't think the vast majority of the American people would want that. And this idea about moneyed interests, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've been in the politics. People spend a lot of money. I mean, I just don't see that is going to cause some state senator to want to overthrow the Bill of Rights. I just don't see that as something that would happen. So I get kind of things that are being said. I think that they're theoretically possible, but I do think that they're unlikely. And I think that the term limits amendment, if that were to start proceeding through the states after either proposal by Congress or by an amendment convention, I think you'd see a lot of Americans say, yeah, we need to do this.
Philip, more thoughts? And in particular,
Sure.
David said that this is a time when people are so polarized. There are these new technologies, these populist forces, that we couldn't expect reasoned deliberation to emerge from a convention.
I share his concern completely about the idea of a constitutional convention that would revise the Constitution. I would oppose that greatly. If that was to be proposed, I would oppose it. What we're talking about, though, is 34 states passing an application explicitly for a convention set up for the purpose to consider congressional term limits and no other issue. And so it's a different animal. And I think that we've had many different, in our history, we've had many different multi-state conventions that achieved their aims and then moved on, and this would be very similar. And to be strictly limited is the key point. I would greatly oppose a general constitutional convention at this point in our history, for sure.
Okay, I have a lot more questions, but yours, as usual, are far better. So I wanted to, and there's so many of them, and they're so great. So let's jump right in, and then we'll sum up. And several of them have to do with the effect of a term limits amendment. One questioner asked, might term limits curb money in politics? Term limits means less need to fundraise and more time to legislate. And another questioner asks whether term limits would tamp down partisan polarization and make more moderate representatives result. Suzanne.
I don't think so to either of those questions. Term limits are a solution to a problem that I think everybody can see. This isn't a secret problem. Everyone understands the dissatisfaction and the mistrust of the governing class in Washington. I think one of the problems that we see when we're talking about term limits is that people really like their own representatives. They want to put term limits on everyone else, but they will keep re-electing the people that represent them, until the end of time. And so I think that that's a key piece that is often left out of this debate. I also think that term limits, while well-intentioned, also release the elected officials from needing to be responsive to the people and be accountable to the people. If you get 2 terms, and maybe you need to be accountable in that first period, right? Because you need to be re-elected. But that second term, you can legislate either closer to what you think rather than what your constituents think. And it's also an opportunity to, this is very cynical, but I think very accurate, take advantage of some of the power and the money that is available in Washington. So, I think that while there are issues, I would recommend that we look at ways to make democracy function better rather than restricting the choices of the voter.
Excellent. You win the Apollo Award for the lighting on that one. It's still flickering, but Philip, we're now on the substance of the benefits of a term limits amendment. 2 questioners asked, would term limits give the upper hand to lobbyists and unduly influence inexperienced legislatures? Someone else says experience gives members knowledge and power. Do term limits increase the powers of staff? Is that good?
Yeah, let me talk about lobbyists. One of the main impetus for the term limits movement is to reduce the influence of lobbyists on our legislatures, and term limits do this in a lot of different ways. The key one is that the relationships, the whole goal of lobbyists is to establish long-term mutually beneficial relationships, and term limits upset that. There is, and also carves out a space of independence for our legislators. And I've heard this argument about how term limits could somehow empower lobbyists. I usually hear this from politicians. Lobbyists don't think that's true. U.S. term limits has run campaigns for 20 years around the country, and all of the money opposing term limits comes from lobbyists and special interests, and none of the money that is funding these pro-term limits campaigns comes from that source. It all comes from individuals. And so lobbyists certainly don't believe that it empowers them. And I would suggest also that there's a study that was just done by Dr. Randy Holcomb at Florida State University that he looked at the levels of spending in states before and after term limits were imposed, and also compared it to other states without term limits. And he said that the results were very significant, that term limits is correlated with lower spending. And that's not a situation that occurs in a place where lobbyists are running the show. Lobbyists generally, as Ron can tell you, come to your office asking for money, not asking you to cut spending. And so term limits, I think that lobbyists are right. They reduce their power, not increase it.
Great. Another Congressman questioner says, I have mixed feelings about term limits with the extent of gerrymandering throughout the United States. What other options are there? What can be done to control gerrymandering? And would term limits decrease? Would term limits decrease polarization? We had a great debate at the Constitution Center with Intelligence Squared, where the audience voted, after hearing the evidence, that gerrymandering is not the cause of polarization. The country is already really polarized because we sort ourselves into filter bubbles through the big sort. So the question, Congressman, is is there any relationship between term limits and decreasing polarization?
So I think it's a good question. Just with the lobbyist thing, Jack Abramoff, the disgraced lobbyist during the Hastert and DeLay Congresses when it was just kind of open season with open corruption, he said that the thing you need to stop lobbyists is term limits. He said he feared term limits as a lobbyist because, as Phil said, all those relationships that you're building for 10, 20 years, those all go by the wayside. In terms of the polarization, yes. So I am a big skeptic that gerrymandering causes it for the simple reason of, where we're at here, we'll never elect a Republican no matter how you draw the district. It's going to elect a Democrat. Not because the legislature's corrupt, but because it's a Democratic area. You go to Florida, we have 67 counties. A Democrat does not have a chance to win, I would say 60 of them, definitely 55 of them. So you have heavily Democratic areas in like Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach, some of the Central Florida, Kissimmee now, some of the college towns, University of Florida, Florida State. The rest tend to be Republican. So those Democrat areas are huge margins. I mean, hundreds of thousands of votes in some of those counties. The Republican counties are like 60-40 more like. So that's just kind of how people live. So when you're drawing districts in Florida, it's really hard to figure out how you could even, I mean, you're talking at the margin, one seat here, one seat there. So I think that it is more of the self-sorting. Here's why I think it would help get over some of the polarization. Because if you're going to take time out of your life to go to the Congress and you are limited to 3 terms in the House, let's say 6 years, now, that's not a lifetime, and I support getting rid of pensions for congressmen too, so that to force them to go. Maybe we can do that as well. But so, and I declined mine when I got in. But so here's the thing. You have maybe 6 years. So just being in Washington for 6 years and kind of doing that, is that really just worth it if you're doing other good things in life? No, I think you're going to want to get something out of those 6 years. And so if you're in the House of Representatives and Nancy Pelosi Speaker and you're a Republican, you may have to try to find some Democrats to join with you on some things. Otherwise, you're going to be there for 6 years and you're not going to have gotten anything done. And so I think that when right now it's always stay there as long as you can, accumulate power and influence, maybe run a committee, all that, you have an incentive to not try to rock the boat, never to buck your party on a lot of these things. Whereas with term limits, to me, the incentives are, let's get some stuff done.
This gerrymandering question seems really important. Wouldn't it be better to end partisan gerrymandering of districts and have publicly financed election instead? Wouldn't that lead to more turnover? And a related question on reform, since primaries are a big part of the problem, why don't we get rid of primaries by ranked choice voting? That's from fairvotes.org. Suzanne, does the League of Women Voters support other good government reforms to decrease polarization and increase compromise that don't involve term limits?
Yes, I mean, so we definitely are working a lot around the gerrymandering issue, although primarily in Pennsylvania working with the state legislature, because that's, as I'm sure all of you Pennsylvanians know, really where most of the gerrymandering happens. In Pennsylvania, however, congressional districts are, the way that they are drawn is mandated by legislation, and they're drawn the exact same way. And what we have often is a bipartisan gerrymandering. So it's not about one party necessarily grabbing power. It's about incumbents trying to maintain those lines. And so, as we're talking about term limits, there are other solutions, such as changing the ways that districts are drawn, making that process more transparent. That would affect much of the same change, but would not be taking this choice away from the voters. I think that ranked choice voting is a really interesting thought. We don't have a specific position on that yet. We are actually working on one as we speak. the primary system is certainly a difficult system, and across the country, because there are such great variations, there's no single, best practice, best way to do it. In Pennsylvania, the closed primaries gets a lot of pushback. I get calls, all through March and April yelling at me about the closed primaries, because it's entirely my fault. But then there's the argument on the other side that you want to close primary because it is in fact the parties choosing their nominees. And so there's a lot of interesting work that's being done with things like ranked choice voting, with things like open primaries, with things like caucuses, to see different ways that we can elect people. I think another piece of it is we haven't been talking at all about access to the ballot box, and I think that that's something that's a really fundamental need. That, again, if we get people to vote, if we get people educated and understanding how their government works and holding their elected representatives accountable, then those term limits just are inherent, right? Because people are not going to re-elect someone who doesn't serve their interests. So there are multiple ways that we can fix this problem, and the governing class and the disconnect between Washington and the people, that don't involve a constitutional amendment.
Great. Okay, just a few more questions, and then we're going to wrap up this segment. Philip, first a broad comparative question. Do other democracies have term limits? And then a practical question. Do you think that President Trump will follow through on limiting terms if the Republicans don't want it? And basically, what are its prospects for actually succeeding?
Let me answer the second one.
Okay.
First, I don't know, but I've been toiling on this term limits project for a while, and I find it very hard to believe, despite the best efforts of people that understand the issue, like Representative DeSantis, that Congress is going to vote to impose term limits on itself. And I think that's why we need to avail ourselves to the device that the founders gave us in Article 5. So I don't know. I'm pleased Trump came out in favor of this. I was surprised by it. I think it's fantastic what's going on in the Congress, and I think we'll get a vote on it with his leadership in the House, and I think that's fantastic. I think just that vote itself will be a giant step ahead, and it could be that it succeeds, or it could be that it just gives more impetus to the Article 5 effort. Either way, it's a big advance. I have no idea how it's going to turn out. It'll be fun to watch.
Sounds great. David, do you or does anyone happen to know if other democracies have term limits and how they turn out? Oh, sorry.
Oh, well, Mexico has term limits in its legislature, and there are term limits on heads of state all across the globe. But most of the term limits Switzerland has term limits on legislature, but most of the legislative term limits in the world are in the United States, and the United States is awash with them. I mean, the president is term limited, over 30 governors are term limited, 15 legislatures are term limited, and there's so many counties and mayors and city councils that are term limited that U.S. term limits can't count them. So this is the test, and I think it's passed.
And if I may, how have those term limited legislatures work out? Do they work better than the non-term limited legislatures?
Yes, well, I mentioned the study that was just done looking at spending issues, and yeah, if reducing spending is a goal, then I think that was one issue that weighs in favor of term limits. It's hard to draw direct lines from a process reform to a specific issue. Whatever your pet issue is, I can't tell you that term limits is going to be good or bad for that issue. But when you look at think tanks and that do scorecards on the overall health of states, according to different metrics that have nothing to do with term limits. I'm speaking of groups like Mercatus Center and the American Legislative Exchange Council and the Tax Foundation and whatnot. If you look at the best performing states in America, term limited states are overrepresented in those top performing states. I'm not going to tell you that's precisely because of term limits, but I can tell you one thing for sure, that an argument that term limits invite people in that are inexperienced and will bring your state to ruin are disproved by that outcome. So I think on the aggregate, term limit states do very well, and then on at the more grassroots level, at the more in the weeds, they absolutely achieve their primary goal, which is competitive elections and rotation in office, which we haven't so much discussed.
Great. Well, I think it's time for the lightning round closing statements. And basically, this is the time for just a few sentences, the elevator speech about why you think or not that we should call a convention of the states to propose a term limits amendment. Congressman.
Well, I think a lot of the things that we discussed apply. This would be a way to really empower voters with more choices, because the way the system is set up, incumbents have designed it to benefit themselves. 80% of the congressional districts in this country, you don't have a functional choice because you're talking about beating an incumbent in a primary, and that is not the best way to really give voice to the American people. I don't think, incidentally, that this is something you should say, oh, it's going to be good for my side or this side. But I think right now, and this is not the reason obviously why I'm doing it, I actually think if you're a Democrat, I think it would benefit the Democratic Party at the congressional level, because young Democrats that are talented, they have nowhere to advance in the House of Representatives right now. All the leadership is old, all the ranking members and the people in line for the, and you have to really stay for 20 years. We, at least on the Republican side, have term limits for committee chair. So I'm trying to get some of my younger Democratic friends to come on board, because I think it would probably benefit them in the short term. And you know what? To have new leadership on that side, even though I'm on the other side, I think that would probably make the House of Representatives a better place to be.
Thanks for that. Suzanne, should we have a term limits amendment or not?
No. I think that the discussion that we've had about constitutional convention of the states is raised a lot of good points, that there are a lot of questions that we just don't know the answers to, and there is a lot of hyperpartisanship and a lot of things that all of us in this room have never seen before. And so opening ourselves up to this risk at this point in time, I don't think is right. I also think that with the term limits issue specifically, that there are other reforms that don't require a constitutional convention that increase access to the ballot box, that make the government work more democratically. And there are internal reforms that Congress can take on as well, such as things like term limits for committee chairs, or not assigning certain things based on seniority. And those are not term limit issues. That's an internal mechanism that Congress could, if it wanted to, take on.
Thanks so much. Philip.
Yes. We should have a constitutional amendment writing convention on the issue of term limits. Since 1970, just shy of 95% of the time that an incumbent in the House has run for their own seat, they've won. In just this last year, 2016, 98% of incumbents running for their own seat in the House won. Okay, there's something wrong with this system. It isn't that we love Congress so much. Polls, everything says that we do not. And it isn't just that we love our own. There's something wrong with this, and I'll tell you one profound thing I want you to take home with you, is that when you don't have a chance to win, it profoundly affects who runs. And I'll tell you who doesn't run is serious, goal-oriented people that we want to have representing us. What we have is maybe gadflies, some naive people that mean well, maybe you have a paper candidate to force the other candidate to spend money. But most all of our elections in this country are lopsided, extremely lopsided. It's money, sure. But think about this. The act with 98% reelection rate of our incumbents, all of the action happens in open seats because a certain congressman either retires or dies or is indicted. And so we have an open seat. Term limits create an open seat in every single district once every 8 years if it's an 8-year term limit. All right? This gives voters choices, and real choices, and lots more of them. So it is something that will reinvigorate our democracy and not have an entrenched incumbency that we can't touch run the show. And the only way maybe we can do it is a convention. Thank you.
David Strauss.
You know, there are lots of bright, shiny ideas that sound really great when you first hear them. And then you try to put them into effect, and they turn out to be disasters. Now, I don't know if term limits is such an idea. I'm kind of 50-50, maybe 60-40 on term limits. But I can tell you there are lots of ideas like that out there, and I think having a constitutional convention is one of them. And I think if we have a constitutional convention, ideas like that will be appealing to people in that convention. Our Constitution is the work of generations. It's the work of ages. We've built it up block by block over time. It's a work of history. And the risk I see, and it might be a small risk, but it is maybe a small chance of it happening, but if it happens, it would be a disaster. The risk is some people will get hold of that document, people in the convention will get hold of this magnificent thing that's been built up over time, this sort of magnificent cathedral we have, and say, I got a better plan, let's do it this way. And that would be a disaster.
Last word to David Super.
The people of this state and of several others surprised the political class and much of the public by deciding to take a chance to shake things up and putting a political neophyte in the White House. We also have unified control of the executive, both houses of Congress, and very soon the Supreme Court by a single party for the first time in a very long time. That shows considerable amount of rolling the dice, and we have yet to see whether that turns out well or not. But that is nothing compared to rolling the dice on our most fundamental document. And it's actually not even rolling the dice once. In all likelihood, for the reasons that Professor Strauss points out, we're going to get it wrong in this convention, and we'll have to have another one. And that's two opportunities to, at least, to open it up. And it ends up with our Constitution being just another law, just another tug of war. Yeah, you got your thing in the Constitution, but it was corrupt, it was no good, I don't recognize it. And at that point, what's left of us as a country? Yes, we've got people in Washington and borders and the flag and all of that, but our national identity starts slipping away. And that's, even if term limits were a very good idea, which I don't think they are, that's way too much of a chance to take. Let's stick with the gambles we just took and not up the ante.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our vote, because after our break, we're going to hear from the Congressman and Governor Rendell. But you've heard a really wonderful panoply of the best arguments on both sides. You voted at the beginning, and I'm going to ask you to vote again on the same question. Should we call a convention of the states to propose a term limits amendment? Who votes yes? And who votes no? Wow. And who changed his or her mind as a result of this discussion? We shifted, I'm seeing, from a yes to a no with a good majority changing their minds. Absolutely fascinating. We're going to come back after a 10-minute break. Please thank our panelists for a superb discussion. Excellent. I think you did it again.
elections by the skin of his teeth.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the concluding keynote conversation of this really fascinating evening. We are so lucky to have joining Representative DeSantis, Governor Ed Rendell. The governor, as all of us know him here, is, first of all, a dear friend of and the vice chair of the National Constitution Center, the founding father of the NCC. Without him, this incredible institution would not have been created. I want you to give him a round of applause for that. And in addition to that great gift that he gave to the nation, he is one of America's most astute political observers, commentators, successful politicians, and in a really dramatic twist, he moved from once opposing term limits to coming to support them. So, Gov, let's begin. Well, you can applaud that as well. Governor, why did you change your mind?
Well, first, let me begin by complimenting all of you for being here. When I spoke to Vince Stango and he said, we have a packed house. I said, that's amazing, given the weather and how cold it is and the winds. And then he said, well, people prepaid. which made you all a little bit less noble. All a little bit. Well, for most of my political career, and for Congressman DeSantis, I've held elective office for 24 years. 8 years as DA, not term limited, I could have continued. 8 years as mayor, term limited, and 8 years as governor, term limited. And for most of my 24 years, I absolutely supported term limits for executives, because I just think you run out of steam, you run out of ideas. It's too much of a burden almost physically to do it. And I think it's good to have someone come in with a new outlook every 8 years in an executive position. But I always believe that the institutional knowledge of having people in a legislative body for 14, 16, 18 years was good and was important, and I was against it. And my theory was, look, we do have term limits, the voters. But as all the things that have occurred in the country for so long, for the last couple of decades, the gerrymandering, which has just been brutal. I have to disagree with the League of Women Voters lady. When I left office as governor, we had 19 congressmen, 13 Democrats, and 6 Republicans. I left 1 year before redistricting. The Republicans took back the governor's office and the legislature in 2010. It went, after they redistricted it in 2012, it went from 13-5 Democrat to 13-6 Democrat to 13-5 Republican. We lost 1 seat because of the census, but it turned around, it flipped dramatically, and redistricting was the main reason it had flipped so significantly. But my experience as governor was what convinced me we needed term limits. First, in Harrisburg, when I came into office, as you recall, I proposed the second biggest tax increase in the state's history. I did so because we had a $2.4 billion deficit that I inherited from the Republican predecessor, and I wanted to put $500 million into early childhood education. We were one of only 9 states that didn't give a nickel to early childhood education. We had a bitter budget battle that lasted till December 21st. I had Democrats come up to me and said, Governor, I know we need this money for education, but I'm 2 years away from my pension. I heard the congressman talk about getting rid of pensions. Absolutely, if we do nothing else, let's get rid of pensions. Because there are people out there who literally hang on until they're qualified for their pensions. And then, as governor, I got very active in infrastructure, which has always been a key issue for me. And Mayor Bloomberg, Governor Schwarzenegger, and I founded the group Building America's Future. And we were working with the Congress to try to get a real infrastructure bill, not just transportation, but the grid, so many other things, our waterways, dams, you name it, everything's corroding in America. And I had a Republican congressman who I don't know if Congressman DeSantis knew, he's passed away, but he was from Ohio, and his name was Steve LaTourette, and he was on the Transportation Committee. And he took me aside and said, Governor, you made a great presentation. I had testified. He said, if we cast a secret ballot on raising the gas tax, we'd have 400 votes in the House and 88 votes in the Senate. Now, let me ask all of you a quick question. And Congressman, this is a very intelligent crew because they're here listening to us on Thursday night. They could be watching Duke play North Carolina, but they're here watching us. How many of you, raise your hand if you know exactly what the federal gas tax is per gallon? I give this speech everywhere when I talk about infrastructure. It's usually 1 out of 100 in very intelligent groups. You can raise it any way you want. Nobody's ever going to notice. We just raised the gas tax in Pennsylvania over 5 years, 32 cents a gallon. Republican governor, I went up and stood with him and had a press conference urging it to happen. The next election, every Democrat and every Republican who voted for it, their opponents used it as an issue. You know how many lost? None. When I raised taxes, $2.7 billion, the second largest in history, not one incumbent who voted for me, Republican or Democrat, lost at the next election. Because people aren't idiots. They know you get what you pay for it. All they want to see, if we're going to raise taxes, let's see something in return for it. So I don't believe it's polarization alone that's killing the country, although it's part of it. It's the fact that we are, as I wrote in 2012 in a book which not enough of you bought, we have become a nation of wusses, and our leaders have lost the guts to make us great. And that's true in Springfield, it's true in Albany, it's true in Harrisburg, and it is doubly true in Washington.
Wow. Congressman, do you agree that we've become a nation of wusses? And then tell us how. Well, actually, let me start with that. What's your response to that?
Well, look, that's a great story. One, it's just great to have somebody like Governor Rendell here who's done so much at very different levels. You have a great city here, great state, and to have him enlisted in the cause, that means a lot, and I think it's great. But I was really taken aback when he was talking about the budget fight where guys are coming up and it's about their pension. And that, I mean, to me, is just like clenching my fist when I hear that, because that is not what serving the people is all about. And when I got elected, I told the folks with the pension I was going to decline it. Not because that is going to make a difference in the debt, it's not, but it was a symbol to my voters that I was going in with their interests in mind, and I was not doing it to benefit myself. I could have done other things to do that. And people still come up to me today, they really appreciate that you were able to do that. So we have incentives like that in Washington. You also have some incentives that are, to me, much more benign. I mean, if you come in and you really want to do good things, you get elected to the Congress, what do people tell you? Well, you just got to wait in line. You know, you got guys that are way more senior to you. Don't rock the boat. Don't get out of step with anybody. Just kind of keep your head down, raise money for people, play the game, and that's how you advance. And so if you don't like the way Washington works, you're kind of in a conundrum because you have to play the game in order to eventually advance in the game. And as a military guy, it's frustrating with so much being based on seniority, because in the military, your rank is determined by merit. So I could be somebody who is a Navy captain in 06, and maybe somebody is a commander one rank below me, but they've been in for 6 years longer than me. Guess what? I'm the superior officer because I've earned it. It's not just because I've hung around a long time. Unfortunately, in Washington, those are kind of the incentives. And so I think if you had term limits, you would get people from a wider variety of parts of American life, not necessarily people who were dedicated to be in politics for 40 years. And some of the people who've been in for 40 years have done a good job. Many have not. But the key is why don't we get people who come and want to just be in it for like 6 years? It's really not worth it right now to be in the House if you only want to dedicate 6 or 8 years to being in the House of Representatives, because you're never going to be able to chair a committee. You're not going to be in the leadership. You're going to kind of be one cog in the machine. Very difficult to have any individuality. So I think term limits helps the incentives that we face now in Washington. And as much of a supporter as I am, I'm not going to say that this is a panacea for everything, but I think it would help get us in a better direction going forward.
Jeff, can I just jump in real quick? The average term of service of committee chairs in the House is 27 years. That means that they started when Lyndon Johnson was president.
Wow. Well, to say more about that, because Governor, the Congressman says Democrats should favor term limits because it'll give them chairmanships more quickly. What is the politics of term limits among Democrats? How much bipartisan support does this have?
It's usually viewed as more of a Republican issue. It emanated from the Contract for America, where many people who got elected that year lived up to it. They voluntarily stepped down. Many people, unfortunately, didn't. It's not a commentary on the people who were elected in 2004. But in 1994, so then the Tea Party took up the issue and the refrain. So it's mostly viewed as a issue that comes from the right or a Republican issue. Democrats, we don't have, and I heard the congressman speaking about the term limits for chairs that the Republicans put in. It's a good idea. We don't have it, and as a result, our chairs are really old, and I guess I shouldn't be talking about really old, but they're really old. And there isn't the movement that the congressman said, which is, I think, an important thing. You go to any business and say to young people going in, you have to wait 20 years before you're going to have a decision-making role in the business. They're gone. They're gone. And so I think Democrats have been more reluctant to get on this issue than Republicans have. But I think you'll find, interestingly, Democrats who served in executive positions in state government will be more in favor of term limits because they've seen what happens in Harrisburg and Springfield and Sacramento.
Congressman, more about the mechanics of running for office, the kind of money you have to raise, and how term limits would make the incentives better.
So you often hear people say against term limits, hey, vote them out. You have the choice. Every election's a term limit. And in theory, that's 100% correct. In practice, it's not true at all. And the reason is, in order to run for office right now, you have to do it in the context of a system that's been designed by incumbents to benefit incumbents. And so take, for me, for example, I ran for Congress in 2012. I had never run for office in my life. I don't have a famous name or anything like that. I'm not wealthy enough to fund my campaign. So guys like me in my freshman class, there were like a handful of us who went from just a private citizen to Congress without having been elected to anything before, have the family name, famous name, or have your own money that you can spend. The reason is because it's very difficult when districts have 700,000 people to get known by the voters. It costs money to do it. It takes a lot of time and effort to do it. Maybe in Congress you can do a lot of grassroots. I did, where you knock on the doors in a primary, but even that is not going to get you. So you have to be able to raise enough money to get your name out there so that people know who you are, and then obviously know who you stand for. And when you're in a country where, regardless of how you even draw the districts, most of the districts are going to go one party or the other, your only hope is to do that, to defeat an incumbent in a party primary. Well, guess what? All the donors who typically give to candidates, they usually are never going to go against an incumbent. Certainly none of the people in the influence industry, but even people back in the district, some business guy that just, not that they want anything, but maybe if they have an issue with an agency, they can kind of call a congressman or something, they're not going to want to give against. So the barriers to entry are very high the way we're doing it. It's difficult to get known if you're not already known. And I think of my freshman class, I don't know, we had 30 members who came in new in 2012. I would say the overwhelming majority were either people who had held elective office and developed kind of a network, people who had famous names, legacies. I think Joe Kennedy was in my class, or people that just funded their own campaign and didn't have to worry about it. And I'm not saying that those folks have done a bad job. Many of them have done a good job. But that, if you limit it to those people, that is a very, very small segment of American society that really has a functional opportunity to run for something like the United States Congress.
Governor, what about this claim that term limits would reduce the role of money in politics? I just moderated a fascinating seminar of state elected officials, and they said that you had to be a millionaire to be elected governor of, say, Tennessee. You couldn't be known otherwise. Would term limits help that question? And are there other things that could reduce the role of money?
Oh, there are plenty of other things that could reduce the role of money. I'll say one thing on a federal level. We should pass a law, and I think down deep, everyone would be in favor of this prospectively. They wouldn't be in favor for their own election, but prospectively. No one who's a registered lobbyist in Washington can give or raise money for a congressman or a senator. Bingo. That changes the whole dynamic. It changes the whole dynamic. And it makes sense. Let the lobbyists earn their money by the cogency of their arguments. And by the way, the best lobbyists in Harrisburg, and even as governor, I would talk to lobbyists, I'd give them an audience. The best lobbyists in Harrisburg were the ones that did the most research, that had the best arguments. They're the ones who maybe didn't get me to change my mind, but got me to modify stuff. And that's a rule that ought to be passed for the good of everyone, for the good of everyone. And that would also diminish the power of incumbency, because incumbents raise their money from lobbyists to the greatest degree. I mean, isn't it true that there's a Monday through Thursday, when the House is in session and the Senate in session, there's at least one fundraiser on virtually every night?
Oh, I mean, not necessarily for each individual member, but there's the Republicans and Democrats both have built like clubs like right off campus, because you can't do it in a federal building. So there's constantly coffees, lunches, things that are going on in both of those. And yes, when you're in Washington, it's you're raising money from within people who have interest before the Congress. It's not as true when you get into your district, to be honest with you. I mean, the vast majority, I ran for the Senate. I was trying to run for the Senate because Senator Rubio said he wasn't going to run for re-election. 100 times, changed his mind. So I ran, but so I had to go and raise money. And when they did like what industry's given to Ron DeSantis, my #1 industry by far was retired. So these are people that were retired, but it's a different ball game in your state or in your district by and large compared to Washington. So I do think that there's a lot of truth to just how the inside Washington, and I'll tell you, if you look at people who do a good job, I think on both sides of the aisle, the people who raise a higher percentage of their campaign money from regular citizens vis-a-vis the Washington tend to be people who I think are doing a better job on both sides of the aisle.
So now we've moved from the more traditionally Republican-affiliated issue of term limits, which has some bipartisan support, to this question of money in politics. Governor, you've identified not allowing lobbyists to have as much influence. Other reforms, overturning Citizens United?
Well, sure.
What else would we put on the table?
Overturning or severely restricting Citizens United. I mean, come on, guys. Corporations aren't people. There's no way you can ever persuade me of that. And by the way, if we could resurrect the founders, and it would be very interesting because everyone speaks for the founders these days, but if we could resurrect the founders and ask them, do you think giving money to candidates is covered by the First Amendment, free speech? Not in your own campaign. I can see an argument that putting money into your own campaign is covered by free speech. But raising money from other people, that there's a First Amendment free speech right to donate money to political campaigns? Are you kidding? Really? Does anybody think that who's got a half a brain? I mean, of course not. So we need a constitutional amendment. I said the Tea Party folks and the Occupy folks. What's the Tea Party folks did a little bit better job than the Occupy folks. One, because they limited the number of issues that they were going to go forward on. And two, because they knew how to organize politically and affected a lot of Republican primaries, very much so. But if you look at the basic tenets of Tea Party and Occupy, the one thing that they had in common was getting big money and special interests out of politics. They should have gotten together, and there should have been a push for a constitutional amendment. Redefine speech, redefine political giving as not covered by free speech. We ought to make that clear.
Representative, one more beat on this. We've just had an election where opposition to corporate influence mobilized voters on both sides and seemed to make a difference in the election. Are Republicans in Congress responsive to this, and are there any efforts to curb the role of big corporate money in politics that Republicans could support?
Well, it's interesting if you look at the role of money in politics. What was the spending ratio in the presidential election? I mean, Trump was outspent 2 or 3 to 1. So the idea that the money determines it is not true. But in the lower down ballot races, you don't need the most money to win, but you do need sufficient resources to become known to the rest of the electorate. And so some of these super PACs that go, honestly, that's like lighting that money on fire, I think, because it just reaches a point where it's kind of the diminishing returns. Here's, though, the issue with, it's great to say, yeah, look, I would love to never have to raise money ever and just serve, but if you're going to run, say, in Florida, a statewide race, and you're a congressman like me, so you're not known, like I'm known on my part of Florida, I'm not known in the Panhandle or in Naples or some of these other places. You know how much money it is just to run a steady diet of TV ads in a week in Florida? It could be about $2 million a week just to do that. But if you don't do it, the voters don't know who you are. So you have to have the ability to get your message out. In terms of how the corporations and their influence, it's interesting. The New York Times is a corporation, and they're doing things. So most Republicans usually don't get it. We don't think we get a fair shake from the New York Times. They're very influential. Different newspapers that are corporate owned in Florida, for example, same way. So you have to have the ability to counteract that. And at the end of the day, if you look at a Citizens United case, what were the facts of the case? Was that some Chinese corporation trying to get involved? No, it was a group, a citizen group, that created a movie that was critical of Hillary Clinton, then Senator Hillary Clinton. And under the existing law, that would have been illegal to do. To me, the First Amendment, I want to err on the side of having the robust debate. So I think it's hard to get Republicans on board with that because at some point, you have to be able to band together as citizens and do it. And it's interesting, most of the people that give to these super PACs are usually individuals. You don't see a lot of the publicly traded corporations doing that because it's very hazardous for them with their shareholders and so on and so forth. And so a final point on the corporate stuff is corporate interests right now are being very active politically opposing Donald Trump. And so if you're saying that corporations don't have any individuality, well, that's being contradicted by how Starbucks is acting, how Lyft, Uber, all these different companies, they are making political statements. This is what this corporate entity stands for. We're against this travel restriction. We're against X. We're against Y. And that is what they're doing. And a lot of people on the left who would be critical of, say, Citizens United are cheering a lot of those companies for getting involved politically against Donald Trump.
Well, not Nordstrom's. But just one quick thing. When the congressman points out that Donald Trump spent far less money than his opponent in the general election, he wasn't computing what the Russians spent for him. So we have no way of knowing how much the Russians spent, but probably a lot. And then presidential elections are different than all other elections because there's so much free media coverage that it diminishes the need for money to a great extent. And Donald Trump, I mean, I love the so-called left-wing media. They all are bitching about President Trump and everything he does, I think justifiably, but they elected him because in the primaries, they gave him so much free coverage. Every speech he made, and they were the exact same speeches, every speech he made in a different state was broadcast from beginning to end. I saw a statistic out of Ohio that John Kasich, his actual speeches during the primary were covered 1/80th of the time that Donald Trump was. Now, the Congress, I'll let you give the good line. Go ahead.
I told the governor, I was like, yeah, that may be true, but Kasich would draw 1/80th of the audience and the viewership that Trump would. But I would make a little bit of a clarification. The media tried to nominate him because they thought he would be a patsy in the general election. So be careful what you wish for on some of these things.
The media tried to nominate him because his speeches got terrific ratings. I know, I worked for MSNBC, NBC, CNBC. When they ran Trump speeches, their ad revenues went through the roof. That's why they gave him so much free time. It's the great American greed that got us.
While we're on Trump, I will just, with the term limits plug, some people will say that you have the choice already, and then I would point out to some folks, well, do you also support repealing the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, which limited presidential terms? And, for example, like the League of Women Voters guests we have, they're against term limits for Congress, but are they going to go to their membership, or are people who don't want term limits going to go to their membership, particularly left-leaning organizations, and join in repealing the 22nd Amendment so Donald Trump can be president for 3 or 4 terms? So, you know,
wait. 3 or 4 terms, you don't believe in God?
I think we got to, on a nonpartisan basis, I have to bring this back to the Constitution, although this is vastly entertaining and bipartisan in its entertaining aspect. Governor, I think you heard the end of the first panel, and my sense is what swayed the audience, which initially voted in favor of term limits, ultimately against it, were the professors David Strauss and David Super said, a convention of the states is too risky. This is such a crazy political time, it could do something nuts. What's your response to that?
Well,
and if not a convention, how else could we get it?
And I agree. I think a convention is too risky. The way I would try to do it, and I'm not involved in the movement, although I'm going to tell Congressman DeSantis if he needs me to speak out at any forum, I'm happy to do it. But the way I would do it is go to Congress, and someone made the point at the end that it has to be a front burner issue for the public. But if enough people go to Congress and say, we want this, and then tell the Congress, you can grandfather everybody. Grandfather everybody that's here right now. The day it passes, grandfather them. And then you get Congress to pass it.
We've actually, I've worked with U.S. term limits and Howie Rich. We developed that last Congress. And the idea is people will say, well, why would they kick themselves out of office? And it's not just kind of impure self-interest. I mean, some of these guys have been working for 8-10 years there. Maybe they're in line to be a chairman or something. They put in a lot of time to be able to do stuff. I can understand why they wouldn't want to vote for something that's going to short circuit everything they work for. So if you tell them, if you're grandfathering in saying, look, you joined under different rules, we're going to put term limits in, and then when new people come in, it's going to apply to them, then they have the situation where their own personal self-interest of advancing in the Congress, whether on good self-interest, bad self-interest, whatever, and the voters' interest and overwhelmingly support that, well, there's no longer a conflict there. So I think grandfathering is probably the one way where it is plausible to get it through the Congress. And even though I support doing the convention route, if we can do it through the Congress, that's been tried and true. Let's go ahead and do it and make a compromise like that. To me, I'd be all in favor of.
All right, well, to sum up, my sense is from the audience that there may be some concern about a convention, but there was initial support for the idea of term limits. So for closing statements, Gov, imagine the Supreme Court hadn't said that state-imposed term limits were unconstitutional. Why don't you make the case for why you think that the states should be able to impose term limits, and basically why term limits are a good idea?
Term limits for themselves, of course they can.
On Congress.
For Congress?
Yeah, for Congress. Why is it a good idea? Summing it up, make the case to the audience.
Well, I actually don't care how it happens. I think we need to make it happen. And whether the states can do it, or whether the Congress can do it, or whether it's a constitutional convention, I think the issue transcends the process. Sometimes the process is important. To be honest, Jeff, I don't know the legalities of the decision enough to comment on it. But you can say the states are closer to the people than the Congress is, and to some extent that's true. The smaller government is, the closer it is to the public. If you're a congressman, you represent how many people now? 787? 700. When you're a state legislator, you represent maybe 150,000. So you tend to be a little closer and have a little bit more dialogue. So that's probably the reason it would be good to start in the states. But look, it's get away from the process and think about the substance. Sometimes, often in American politics, we get caught up in the process so much that we forget about the substance. And keep our eye on the ball, the substance here. It will serve us well to have term limits. It will help a little bit on the polarization, help a little bit diminish the influence of money, and help an awful lot encourage. I mean, those guys who came to me with their pension and said, I know the kids need the money for education, they almost had tears in their eyes. And I just felt like grabbing them by the lapels and say, man up. First of all, you're not going to lose. You're not going to lose, and they didn't. But man up and do it. To get the necessary votes for my tax increase, I had to give the 18 Republicans in the House who put us over the top, I had to give them letters saying that I wouldn't campaign against them, and if their Democratic opponent or a primary opponent campaigned against them for voting for the income tax increase, that I would campaign for them, or I would write a letter for them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got to make this work again. And I believe term limits is an important facet in getting our government to be more responsive. As I think I heard Congressman DeSantis say in his summation in the prior panel, look, they've got to be thinking about what's right for all of you, not what's right for them.
Beautiful. All right, Congressman, you get definitely applause for the governor. Congressman, you get the last word. I'm going to take the process issue out and ask you to make the case for the audience for why you think that Congress should propose an amendment, a term limits amendment?
Well, I think that it's a tried and true way to do it. I think with Donald Trump supporting it, he can get the media to cover it. The American people will see that, and I think will respond. There's one argument that it hasn't necessarily been brought up, but sometimes it's argued against term limits that we have all this expertise and that if we don't do it, no one's going to know what's going on. And look, there's some members who have been very knowledgeable that I've seen. Don't get me wrong, and this is not a broadside against all of them, but I mean, Congress isn't exactly lighting the world on fire right now. We have 320 million people in this country. We got people that are very talented. There's not one person walking the halls of that Congress that is indispensable, not even close. And it's kind of fitting that we're here in Philadelphia because, you know, the one guy who presided, George Washington, over the convention, obviously the first president, first he surrendered his sword as the commanding general after he won the revolution. Earth-shattering thing to give up power like that. And then he walked away from the presidency after 2 terms and set this precedent. And it was a very important precedent because Washington, if anyone was indispensable, he was indispensable. But he said, you know what? No, we'll have a new president, and the republic is going to endure because it's a government of laws, not a government of men. And I think that kind of spirit, we're much more likely to get a return to that if we have term limits, if it's not a 20, 30, 40-year vocation, where, yes, you're in touch with the people because you do got to get reelected a couple times, but your whole life is not consumed with how to position yourself to be in Washington for your whole adult life. I think it would be a great thing to do if we can do it through the Congress, and I'd be interested if Jeff's willing to poll the audience. Yeah. Forget about the convention route. You know, if we can do it, or any of the concerns you have about that, put that aside. If we can just do it through the Congress, would you support it? And if you do support it, I think we are going to get a vote on it this year in the House of Representatives. It'll be the first time in over 20 years. And I can tell you, if the voters are keyed on it, I don't know that there are very many districts throughout the country where voting against term limits would be a positive for you. I think it's going to be a negative in virtually every district throughout the country, red or blue.
Beautiful. First a round of applause for the Congressman. And then I do want to poll you on exactly the question that he posed. So do you believe that Congress should propose a term limits amendment? Who is in favor? And who is opposed? Excellent. Even more overwhelmingly than our initial polling. So when we take the question of the convention of the states out of it, we have overwhelming support for a term limits amendment. This has been a model of engaged, substantive, meaty, wonky constitutional debate. It's been so great, and now we're going to have an incredibly glamorous reception outside. Because you're members of the Constitution Center, let's go have some drinks, and thanks to our great guests.
Great job.
Hey, thank you. Yeah.
Good luck.
That was good.
Good luck. And you know what?